If a crow keeps returning to your yard, this is what it remembers about you. There is something unsettling about being recognized by a wild animal. Not just noticed for a moment, but remembered. You walk outside into your yard one quiet morning, and there it is again, the same crow, perched on the same fence, the same branch, the same corner of the roof where it always seems to wait. At first, you tell yourself, it means nothing. Crows live everywhere. They move constantly. It could be any bird. But then something strange begins to happen. The timing becomes too precise. It appears when you step outside. It watches while you water plants. It calls from nearby trees when your routine changes. And eventually, a thought begins forming in the back of your mind. What if this crow actually remembers you? Because crows are not like most birds. They don't simply pass through the world reacting to instinct. They observe, they compare, they recognize patterns, and perhaps most unsettling of all, they remember individuals. Not just dangerous humans, not just food sources, people, specific people, your movements, your routines, your behavior, your emotional rhythms. And if a crow keeps returning to your yard over and over again, there may be something about you it decided was worth remembering. Tonight, we enter the hidden psychological world of crow memory and the quiet things these birds may carry about you long after you've stopped noticing them at all. The first thing a crow remembers is whether you are predictable. Most humans think intelligence looks dramatic. Problem solving, tool use, complex language. But for crows, survival depends on something simpler, prediction. The world is dangerous for a crow. Cars, predators, humans, noise, sudden movement. So crows constantly scan for one thing above all else, patterns. And humans are full of patterns. You leave your home around the same time every morning. You open the same gate. You park in the same spot. You walk through your yard carrying familiar objects. To you, these actions feel meaningless. To a crow, they become a behavioral signature, a kind of silent identity. Over time, the crow begins anticipating you before you even appear. It knows the sound of your door, the rhythm of your footsteps, the hour your porch light turns on. And once a crow can predict your behavior, you stop feeling random to it. You become stable. In nature, stability matters, because stability can become trust. This is why some people notice a crow appearing more consistently over time instead of less. The bird is not randomly wandering back. It has learned your pattern. And now your presence fits into its understanding of the environment itself. It remembers how you move when no one else is around. Humans behave differently when they think they are alone. You can see it in tiny things. The way you sigh while standing in the yard. The way you stare at the sky after a difficult phone call. The exhausted slowness in your movements after a long day. And crows notice body language with extraordinary precision. In fact, much of crow survival depends on reading emotional intent through movement alone. Fast movement, aggressive posture, relaxed posture, focused attention. These details matter deeply to them, which means the crow visiting your yard may remember something most humans overlook completely: your emotional energy. Some people move gently through spaces. Others move unpredictably. Some slam doors. Some pause quietly beneath trees. To another human, these differences barely register. But to a crow, movement tells stories. And over time, those stories become memory. This may explain why certain crows appear strangely comfortable around specific people while remaining cautious around others. They are not simply reacting in the moment. They are reacting to remembered behavior. It remembers, whether you notice small things. There is another reason crows become interested in certain humans: attention. Crows are intensely observant creatures, and strangely enough, They seem drawn toward observant humans too. Most people rush through life without looking closely at the world around them. But some people pause. They notice bird song. They notice changing weather. They notice silence. And occasionally, these people notice the crow. Not with fear, not with annoyance, but with curiosity. That small moment changes everything, because now the crow is no longer invisible background wildlife. It becomes acknowledged. Many long-time crow observers describe a subtle shift after repeated eye contact. The bird begins lingering longer, watching more openly, appearing closer than before. Not because it suddenly loves humans, but because mutual awareness changes animal behavior. The crow realizes, this human notices, and in the strange psychology of intelligent animals, being noticed matters. It remembers safe humans. Scientists studying crows discovered something astonishing years ago. Crows can remember human faces for extremely long periods of time. Even more surprising, they communicate those memories socially, meaning one crow can teach another crow which humans are dangerous. But what receives less attention is that crows also remember safety. The human who never throws objects, the person who walks calmly, the quiet gardener, the old woman who speaks softly while scattering seeds. Safety creates emotional neutrality, and emotional neutrality creates familiarity. Eventually, the crow stops seeing you as an unpredictable threat. You become part of the landscape, and that changes the entire relationship. Wild animals rarely waste energy returning repeatedly to places associated with stress. So when a crow repeatedly chooses your yard, it may be remembering something profoundly simple. You make the environment feel safe enough to return to. It remembers your routine better than you think. There is something deeply eerie about being studied by a creature you barely notice. Yet this is exactly what crows often do. Over weeks, months, sometimes years, they collect tiny pieces of behavioral information. When you mow the lawn, when you leave for work, when guests arrive, when your dog goes outside, and slowly, the crow builds a mental schedule of your world. This is why people sometimes feel shocked when a crow appears during unusual moments. Moments when routine changes. You leave the house much later than usual, and suddenly the crow is already there watching. You skip your normal gardening routine for several days, and the crow begins calling loudly nearby. Scientifically, the bird may simply be reacting to environmental inconsistency, but emotionally, it feels much stranger, because it creates the sensation that something has quietly memorized your life. It remembers grief. This is where crow behavior begins affecting humans emotionally in powerful ways. Crows appear unusually sensitive to disruption, especially repeated disruption. When a familiar person stops appearing, crows notice. When routines change suddenly, they notice. And because humans are emotional pattern-making creatures, we often attach meaning to these moments. A widow continues seeing the same crow after her husband dies. A retired man notices crows gathering during long, silent afternoons. Someone recovering from illness begins recognizing a familiar bird outside their window every morning. Of course, science alone cannot prove emotional symbolism. But emotionally, these encounters feel important because crows themselves appear deeply connected to memory and social awareness. Crows recognize absence. They recognize interruption. And perhaps that is why humans project emotion onto them so easily. Because grief itself is the experience of noticing absence everywhere. And crows seem strangely aware of absence too. It remembers feeding. But not only feeding. Skeptics often reduce crow relationships to one explanation: food. And yes, food matters. Crows are opportunistic and highly intelligent. They quickly remember reliable food sources. But food alone does not fully explain the emotional reactions people have with crows. Because many individuals report continued crow visits even after feeding stops, the bird still watches, still appears nearby, still follows familiar routines. Why? Because by that point, the relationship has become behavioral. The crow remembers the entire environment associated with you, the sounds, the timing, the emotional predictability, and intelligent creatures become attached to familiar systems, especially in uncertain environments. In many ways, the crow no longer returns only for food. It returns because your yard became part of its remembered world. It remembers loneliness. There is a reason crow stories often become deeply personal. Lonely people notice patterns more intensely. They become emotionally attached to small consistencies. And crows are creatures of consistency. They return repeatedly, observe quietly, maintain routines. For someone living alone, this can feel unexpectedly profound. The crow arrives each morning, waits nearby, calls from the same tree. Eventually, it stops feeling random. It begins feeling familiar, almost comforting. Not because the crow understands your life in a human way, but because familiarity itself has emotional power, especially in isolated lives. And perhaps this explains why so many people describe crows almost like silent companions. Not pets, not mystical messengers, something stranger, witnesses. It remembers your emotional states. One of the most unsettling things about intelligent animals is how accurately they respond to human emotional shifts. A person who is anxious moves differently, breathes differently, exists differently in space, and crows notice subtle environmental changes constantly. Some people begin seeing crows more frequently during emotionally difficult periods, during divorce, during grief, during illness, during burnout. Partly, this happens because humans themselves become more observant during emotional pain. But there may be something else happening too. Your routines slow down. You spend more time outside. You sit quietly. You become predictable in new ways. And predictability draws observation, especially from creatures built to study behavior. This creates a haunting emotional loop. The crow observes your altered routine. You notice the crow more intensely because of emotional vulnerability. And slowly, the bird becomes psychologically linked to that chapter of your life. Years later, some people cannot see crows without remembering certain emotional periods entirely. It remembers the ones who disappear. But perhaps the most emotional thing a crow remembers is absence. Imagine this for a moment. For years, an elderly man sits in the same chair every morning feeding birds. The crows learn him, his posture, his timing, his voice, his predictable kindness. And then one day, he is gone. No movement on the porch, no scattered peanuts, no familiar shape beneath the morning light. The environment changes instantly, and crows notice change. Researchers studying crow intelligence often focus on problem solving and memory, but perhaps the most emotionally powerful part of crow intelligence is their relationship with continuity. They remember what belongs, and when something familiar disappears, the absence itself becomes noticeable. There are stories of crows returning repeatedly to homes where familiar humans no longer appear, waiting briefly, watching silently, then leaving again, not with human mourning, but with confusion inside broken routine. And maybe that is why these stories affect people so deeply, because humans fear being forgotten. Yet somewhere in the natural world, a wild creature may still carry traces of your existence in memory. The sound of your gait, the shape of your movement, the timing of your routines. A crow may not understand your name, your dreams, or your history, but it remembers something simpler. You were there, regularly, predictably, quietly, and for a highly intelligent creature navigating a chaotic world, that mattered enough to remember. So the next time a crow returns to your yard, landing in the same familiar place, watching with that unsettling stillness, consider something strange. You may not be looking at a random bird at all. You may be looking at a creature carrying memories of you, assembled slowly over months, or even years, through thousands of tiny observations you never realized were happening. And perhaps the most haunting question is not whether the crow remembers you, but what exactly it remembers most. Have you ever felt like a crow recognized you, or kept returning during a specific period in your life? Tell us your story in the comments.